Like Mr. Robinson said, my name is Dr. Lindsay Lunsford. I'm here at Tuskegee University in the Carver Integrative Sustainability Center, and I have the great honor and privilege of introducing Mr. Chris Newman of Sylvanaqua Farms. I'm going to briefly read just a little bit from his bio for you all, but if you guys want to follow along in the program, it is there as well. Mr. Newman and his wife, Annie, got into agriculture after a health scare and in search of healthier lifestyles and a more meaningful and impactful work. And so they got into the world of small sustainable farming. Chris quickly found the economic model for small holding to be fatally flawed, especially with respect to marginalized people, both as producers and consumers. Since then, he shifted from a focus on his own farm to architecting an integrated worker owned food economy where farms and other food businesses can multiply and thrive at scale, making nutritious food accessible beyond the privileged minority. Chris is the founder of Sylvanaqua Farms, a food processor and marketer, and Something Else Society, which is a nonprofit that incubates Black, Indigenous, and people of color led businesses operating in the Chesapeake Bay food shed. He lives and works in Montrose, Virginia, with his wife Annie and their two daughters. So, with no further ado, I welcome Mr. Newman to speak to us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lunford. I appreciate that introduction, and yeah, so I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit today about the work we're doing here in Virginia, in the shadow of Washington D.C. We're about an hour and a half south of the nation's capital, and I'm just going to give everybody a heads up about my keynotes. I'm not a very polished kind of guy. I'm more of a farmer and cowboy. And when I do these talks, especially when I'm doing these talks with a Black audience, I tend to do it like I'm in a barbershop. Like back in the day when I needed to go to a barbershop. But that never really dies, right? So, my language is going to be very informal and sometimes coarse, and that's my effort to be real with y'all and to present the truth of agriculture and agribusiness and the food system and the challenges that it faces with climate change going on and sleet in Texas and snow in Saudi Arabia and all the kind of craziness that's going on. I think it's really important to be direct and truthful in our language and how we talk to one another about these issues. So forgive me in advance if I'm real casual about this. So as Dr. Lunford said, these days, I'm at the head of Sylvanaqua Farms, which used to be kind of an integrated small farm that did, livestock ranching and did direct market sales at farmers markets and to restaurants and did its own distribution and operated at that small family farmer scale. And we did that for a few years until we realized there were problems, like really, really big problems with that, which I'm going to talk about in detail. But today, we are mostly a marketing, processing, and distributing collective that works within a larger collectives of separate, independently worker-owned businesses that are livestock ranches, market gardens, truck farms. We've got some food trucks coming on board. We have some restaurants and bakers coming on board. We have us kind of in the middle as the processor and the marketer, and our business is about to split into separate processing and separate marketing. Um, it's very much reflective of kind of the traditional agribusiness thing that you see now, where you have an input sector, you have an agricultural production sector, and you have a food service sector. The difference with us being that we are loosely integrated among all our businesses beyond what you'd see in a traditional agricultural co-op or agricultural collective. So all of the businesses in our system are united in pursuing regional food sovereignty in our particular area, which includes Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, Richmond, Virginia, Charlottesville, Virginia, Fredericksburg, Virginia, the Hampton Roads, Newport News area in Virginia, a food shed that includes somewhere between 12 and 15 million people, depending on how far west you want to push our boundaries. So we're united in pursuing that goal. We're united in operating on a land and capital collective and commons. So we farm land and we operate land and steward land and protect land and air and water and food not as individual entities, like this family owns this farm and this farm owns this piece of land and this outfit owns this, but rather the land is held in commons through a variety of vehicles. And we operate it under a mutually agreed upon plan for protecting that landscape. And the other things that we're united by is each business has a commitment to worker ownership, cross-cutting ownership, which means that people who own the livestock ranches, for example, will own a few shares in the processing cooperative so that they have a vote and they can, actually not be subject to some problems that you see in distributed agribusiness, like the tournament system in the poultry industry and other things that can work well by and large, but when they don't work well, there's big problems, especially for the farmers, and issues with exploitation, et cetera. And we also have what we kind of call borderless employment. So the good news about the type of agriculture that we do, which is largely regenerative, which is a term I take issue with a lot, and I'm not going to bore everybody with that today. That's another keynote. That farming isn't all that difficult. It doesn't take that much time. The time that farmers do spend doing that, they're paid a living wage. They're paid very well, but there's only so much work to do. It doesn't take that long to move the cows. It doesn't take that long to weed gardens that are done in an indigenous way and done in a certain polyculture way at scale. So it's nice for those folks to be able to pick up work in the marketing organization, in the processing facilities, doing deliveries, doing fulfillment, doing account management, doing the business stuff that constitutes most of what consumers wind up spending on the food dollar and where most of the wage work comes from, to make sure that we avoid that poor farmer issue that tends to plague this industry. Excuse me. And the last thing that kind of ties us all together is full financial transparency. So every business can see everybody else's books. Everybody knows how much money I make. Everybody, I could look at any ranch right now and know exactly how much money they've spent to the day. And not only for like oversight and to know what people are doing, but also to be able to help people out, to let people know it's like, hey, you're spending 20% more on feed than this other farm. Why is that? And what can we do about that? How can we keep your costs low so that the food going to the end consumer is also kept at a fairly low price, and to make sure that we can replicate our systems and methods so that we're able to ultimately operate across thousands and thousands of acres that are maintained in a sustainable way. So that's what we're doing now. And it took a really, really friggin' long time to get there. So I'm going to tell a little bit of my story, which is a sad series of screw ups that lasted like 4 or 5 years, because I came into farming from the outside, which is, I think, fairly rare to have somebody who doesn't have kind of an agricultural birthright or a farming background to come into agriculture and stick around for a while and not wind up like in the nonprofit sector or, on the speaking circuit for a living. I'm here because Lindsay asked me to be, and this is Tuskegee, and I know my 104-year-old grandmother would really, really want me to talk, for Tuskegee, but like this isn't what I do. I do farming, I do food, I feed people. Like that's my job. That's where I get my bread and butter. So when I got into farming, this would have been back in maybe 2013, and like Dr. Lunsford said, I had a health scare. I worked as a software engineer, kind of a CTO kind of role when I was in my late 20s, and the work was terrible. We used to contract for the IRS, and they're not very happy people for reasons I think we can all identify with. I guess I wouldn't be very happy if I was an auditor and, I don't know, messing with people's lives every day. So I guess I'd be sad too. But it was a really toxic work environment, sleeping at the office, your work was your life, was your work was your life. It was kind of like working at Google for a tenth the pay. And not that the pay was bad, but yeah, we got sick of that. And my wife said, after I had a cancer scare because of the stress, she said, your career in tech is over, which I guess is why married men live longer, because they have wives to tell them they're being foolish. And we decided to move up our plan to kind of retire to the country as gentleman farmer type people. We decided we're going to push that plan up about like 30, 40 years, something like that. So our first plan was we were going to raise bison. We were going to focus on indigenous meat, indigenous seeds, rare corn, rare squash, rare beans. We were going to work for a lot of the seed keeper networks, indigenous seed keeper networks that are in the mid-Atlantic and up to New York and Haudenosaunee country. And but the big thing was we were going to do bison. We were going to be bison ranchers. To learn the bison trade, I went to a bison ranch that was about 2 hours away in Culpeper, Virginia, and I saw a bison cow jump over a 6-foot fence from a standstill and said, nah, like I'd rather not die, like in my first 6 weeks, because I just saw this thing jump straight 6 feet straight up in the air. I'd never seen anything like it. Like let's do something completely different. So we wound up coming across, kind of doing research and okay, how do you get into farming? How do you go from zero to farmer and make like a middle class living and do it right and do it sustainably and take care of the landscape and feed the community, et cetera. And back then, in the early 2010s, like 2012, 2013, the leading voice in that type of agriculture was Joel Salatin, who, if anybody knows anything about me now, like I've got a lot of issues with that guy, and we've gone at it publicly about a lot of things. But back then, this was a guy who was offering a really hopeful, if incredibly simplified message about what's wrong with agriculture. What is the deal with so much of the food dollar going towards agribusiness? What is the deal with cheap food being everywhere and making people sick? It really spoke to, in a really, I don't know, at a surface level, issues that I'd seen around food apartheid and people who were food insecure in the communities I grew up in Washington, D.C., east of the river, not on the capital part, but Chocolate City, Washington, D.C. Part of what he said spoke to me. And part of the message around like vote with your food dollar and like kind of lift yourself up by your bootstraps, I kind of went, that's kind of standard libertarian rhetoric, and I just kind of let it slide because, to be Black and Indigenous in America, you kind of have to. But his technicals around how to start farming and how to come in from the outside were very, very compelling. And anybody that knows anything about, this guy and the farm to table movement more broadly, it's all about small family farms are going to compete with traditional agribusiness, which tends to be extractive, which tends to be exploitive, and tends to create health outcomes over the long term that maybe aren't so great. We're going to compete with them environmentally, we're going to compete with them nutritionally, et cetera, by having lots and lots and lots of small farms that are going to compete in the aggregate, putting our products directly into the market like that. That was supposed to be the plan. So it didn't take very long. I think we started this like around our first full season was 2014. By 2017, my wife and I knew something is wrong here. There was no way to make a living in this farm to table space where you're doing the farming, you're doing the G&A, you're doing the marketing, the accounting, the bookkeeping, the distribution, the cold calling, the sales, the product stories, the inventory, the management, the human resources part. Like you've got 2 or 3 people trying to do the jobs of, 8, 9 people, and you're trying to move enough product where you can make a full-time living, which is an incredible amount of product at the margins we look at, even when you're selling at the prices that I do. It was impossible. It's like, I'm not going to be in my late 20s and early 30s forever. And I'm not going to be able to work this hard, like, 20 years from now, 25 years from now. And the only way to bring in new people, younger people, either my own kids or other people that just want to get into this work and do the physical parts of it, there was really no way to do it unless you were willing to exploit people. And that means using volunteer labor. That means sacrificing your own body. You can exploit yourself. You absolutely can. That is a thing. Using people like through the Woofer program, agritourism, like having a labor force based on people coming in and working for next to nothing just because they thought it was the right thing to do is not how you build a labor pool. Like that's just not sustainable. Like you'd fail out of any business school in the country, putting that forward as the way to support your business labor wise. And that kind of that kind of exploitation, that kind of relying on free labor, that deprofessionalization of agriculture, where any amateur feels like they can come in and do it right, which by the way included me. I came in from tech, I'd read a couple books, it's like, oh yeah, I can do this. We tend to think farming, we being on the outside of farming tend to think it's easy. We think farming is done by hayseeds and simple people, and it's wrong. It's bullcrap. It's there's no it's really hard to convey just how sophisticated and difficult and how much knowledge, ancestral knowledge, technical knowledge, engineering, and so forth goes into agriculture. And that's something that people on the outside of agriculture tend not to tend not to understand. So we have this pervasive amateurism in farming that makes our economic model, especially in small farming and in farm to table farming and these alternative modes of land management and feeding people and feeding communities, makes them fundamentally unworkable. So like around 2017, we had this kind of come to Jesus moment where anybody who's ever done any kind of contracting with the federal government, there's this website called sam.gov. I think it used to be called FedBizOps or something like that. And on sam.gov, you can look at every federal contract to purchase anything that the government needs. It can be weapons, it can be ammunition, it can be airplanes, it can be mechanical equipment, it can be office supplies, and it can be food. So I just kind of, decided to pick through sam.gov real quick just to take a look at the scale, say, of government procurement, because I think somebody from Aramark at something had approached us once, and we're trying to do something with sustainability and asked if we could supply something like 400 chickens a week. And I just kind of looked at him like, are you kidding me? I'm one guy, and like everybody else around me is, they're kind of failing out of the industry, and like, who could do this? So I go into FedBizOps, I find a contract for, I think it was the Bureau of Prisons or something. And this was for one facility. There was a contract for one facility for one quarter's procurement. They had one line item in their contract that said they needed 25,000 pounds of ground beef and, something like 5,000 pounds of chicken leg thigh quarters and something like 4,000 pounds of like stuffed chicken breasts or something like that. It was a level of scale where when I looked even at the, and I'm sorry, you're hearing sleep bouncing off this truck that I'm in because I got to avoid my kids while I do this. So yeah, I looked at the scale of this thing and was looking at some of the bigger players that are kind of in this industry. So like White Oak Pastures or Polyface or, some of the big guys that we think of being like, the leaders in sustainable ag. Even these big guys couldn't come close to fulfilling these contracts, even as a rounding error. If you took their whole poultry production, like, all of Polyface's production, 6 months of their production would fill one line item for one quarter for this one facility, for this one thing. So, and it got to the point where we realized, we are not able to, we being in the farm to table movement, are not able to produce enough food, protect enough land, get ourselves on enough acreage to make any kind of a meaningful difference in the marketplace or in the environment. And it amazed me that nobody who was at least in leadership. I think there were lots of people, marginalized people who don't get the microphone a lot. We're talking about this, like, farm to table seems like elitist bullcrap, but nobody in charge of the movement was really saying that. Nobody was saying it out loud. Nobody was admitting it. And this whole strategy that lots and lots of small farms are going to proliferate and compete with conventional agriculture did not make sense when, I come in 2012, 2013, and I come in and there's like 13, 14 other farmers coming in at the same time as me in the same local food shed as me, like just north of Charlottesville. And 3 years later, 2 of us are left. And the only reason we're left is because the one guy, white guy, inherited land from his dad. And the only reason I made it is because I came from tech and had a lot of money to burn making mistakes and was able to telecommute as a software engineer when the bottom fell out of my financial model in the beginning. That was the only reason we were able to succeed. And that tends to be in our movement, in people that are coming in from outside of agriculture and trying to do the right thing and participate in this movement. That's the story over and over and over again. The few people that make it, the few people that are left, inherit a bunch of money, inherit a bunch of land, or both, or they come from a lucrative industry on the outside where they have a lot of room to fail, which is the category I came from. So there's no way this movement is going to work if it's relying on rich software engineers and rich white people inheriting a bunch of stuff. Like, we got to do something completely different. So that kind of got my wife and I, but at this point, especially me, because right around that point, we decided to have kids, to really look at, how did agriculture get to be this way? How do we have an agriculture that seems like it doesn't work for farmers, but it really works for agribusiness, and the outcomes for people on the ground, food is cheap and abundant, but it's not exactly great for you. We're a very calorie dense culture, but we're a very nutritionally deficient culture. How did it get to be like this? And so that led me down a rabbit hole of doing something that people in the farm to table movement tend not to do, which is talk to people who are in conventional agriculture. Talk to people who have actually run like multi-thousand-acre grain operations in Nebraska. Talk to people who are agricultural journalists who've worked for like RFD TV or Farmers Business Network and things like that, and like get the perspective from the other side. And what we learned doing a combination of that and me just kind of tapping back into my own history, because I grew up with very militant parents. Who, I went to this rich private school in Northern Virginia, whatever, and I would come home and mom would make me watch Roots and dad would make me watch 500 Nations, and like I'd have to read stuff by Medgar Evers and Malcolm X, and The Trees is a Crazy Horse, and all these revolutionaries. I had to read Howard Zinn. I read Vine Deloria Jr., stuff, and I'm like 12, 13 years old, just like, again, blowing my hair off, back when I had it. And it was wild stuff. So it's like, why don't I go back into that and really look at what's going on with agriculture? Because the story we get is that farmers are under siege, farmers are drowning in debt, everything is unfair to the farmers. We need to give the farmers more money, we need to give them more aid, they need more, people need to appreciate the farmers more. It's all about like this class of farmers being this like beat down, set upon kind of cohort of people. And what I found out when I started digging under the covers was amazing. So I'm going to share my screen, or at least I'm going to try to. Let's see, where's this thing? Here we go. Can everybody see that? Yay. Okay. So, so here's the thing that I think is a fundamental issue with how we look at, again, when I say we, I'm talking about people outside agriculture. When we look into agriculture, we tend to think of, all the problems that agriculture has now. There's this idea that we used to do agriculture right. Sometime before the Green Revolution, sometime before we took World War II munitions and decided to turn it into chemical-based fertilizers and really supercharged agriculture as a matter of national security policy and really like removed it from the soil and made it less about farmers and more about saying F you to the Soviet Union, stuff like that. There's this idea we did it right, and now we lost our way, like sometime between like 1950 and 1970. And now, oh God, if we could only go back to the way it was in the 1930s or in the 1890s or in the 1790s, then everything would be okay. And no. So to kind of go into that, an indigenous perspective, and let me tap into this one other key element of my background. I'm an enrolled member of the Choctaw Band of Piscataway Indians. So we're the indigenous people of Southern Maryland and DC, part of a tribal confederacy that ran most of what's below Washington, DC and above the Potomac River. And my family and my clan come specifically from a little place called Choctaw, which is right on the river, directly across the river from where I farm today. Like if you go that way, the Potomac River is like 200 yards that way. And if you look right over that, that's where my old tribe's reservation was before it was dissolved when at the end of the American Revolution. So if you take a good, honest look at the history of agriculture in the United States, it was all about occupying land and extracting wealth from that land. And agriculture was not the thing that necessarily had to be the way to do it, but it turned out to be the most efficient way for the people that were coming here. The United States and the whole age of discovery around, the close of the 15th century and going into the 16th century was really all about European monarchs on the continent trying to figure out, how do we continue to finance this cycle of war and debt in the service of expanding and maintaining empires. The whole age of discovery was about that. It wasn't about exploration for this, for its own sake. It wasn't about modern space age type stuff where, you go out to space just to see what's there. It was, we need to find resources because we got wars to fight and we got Italians to pay. So over they come to Africa, over they come to the United States and to the New World, over they go into Asia and to the global South. And the whole point has been to occupy land and extract wealth. When people like Christopher Columbus comes over, he comes over looking for gold, has a hard time finding it, yada, yada, yada. Next thing you know, we're farming indigo and tobacco and cotton and sugarcane and growing all these heavy feeder crops where, especially at first, the whole point was to ship them back to Europe and turn them into money. That was the point. There was, it wasn't about feeding people. Feeding people was a thing that was kind of secondary. It's all right, grow enough corn with the Indians so you don't starve to death. But why we're here is to grow indigo and rice and sugarcane. That's the point, because this stuff's got to go back to Europe. Somebody's got to buy it. That was the point. The point was to occupy land, extract wealth. Over time, mechanization starts coming in. So you're able to have, fewer people farming more land. When you have more land, it requires more mechanization. So you wind up with this kind of vicious cycle where, the more mechanization you've got, the more land you're able to farm, the more money you're able to get, the more wealth you're able to extract. But then when you've got that more land, you need more mechanization, more land, more mechanization. Farms get bigger, farms get more sophisticated. And as you have machines that are able to do this agriculture, where you're relying less and less on a labor force, you wind up with rural depopulation. So you have people fleeing rural areas. You have places where I am now where the local town has 400 people in it. But the economy here is entirely commodity agriculture. It is all, corn, canola, soy, and a few guys grow wheat around here. That's it. It's an economy that's plagued with resource curse, where all of the tax dollars and all the funding comes from these kind of extractive industries, and there's no real democracy here. It's really kind of a feudalized, kind of weird fiefdom kind of vibe down here. And then on top of the fact that you have machines replacing people, back in the day, my grandfather, who used to be he used to farm peanuts and cotton and corn and tobacco and stuff like that down at Virginia Tidewater. You had an assist from racial violence to get people of color out. You had an assist of racial violence to get indigenous people off their landscapes. You had allotments, you had the Dawes Acts, you had black codes, you had Jim Crow, you had the Red Summer. Wherever you had black people who were successful, wherever you had indigenous people who were successful, you had organized white-led efforts, often with state sponsorship, to terrorize them out of existence. So you wind up with this extraordinarily depopulated but resource-rich areas in these rural areas, and that winds up concentrating political power. So you wind up with outsized power in the Electoral College. You wind up with equal representation in the Senate, even though you might have 1/10 of the population of another place. You have gerrymandering that kind of compounds that political issue, and you have this local political hegemony. It's anybody that's ever lived in a small rural area knows there's 2 or 3 families that run everything. They decide who gets the contracts. They decide where the tax dollars go, the property tax dollars that come in. They decide what gets zoned and what doesn't. If a young black kid wants to come in and start a poultry processing plant or whatever, they're going to see that new guy and be like, nah, we're not going to give you your building permit. We're not going to give you the funding. We're not going to give you the zoning. So you have this pressure to keep these places depopulated, to keep them devoid of new opportunity and of kind of democratic participation in rural economies that could actually help in the long term. But big fish in a small pond tend to want to be big fish in a small pond. And that's the way it is here. So you have that concentration of political power, and when you're able to control the political purse, you're able to have like 4 or 5 companies basically write the farm bill. And so you have wealth subsidies that come not only in the form of direct payments, but you also have things like price insurance, crop insurance, biofuels, plastic. You have the federal government creating markets that nobody ever asked for, just to have these huge mechanized agricultural commodities to have somewhere to go. This is the thing where I try to tell vegans, especially because, I'm a rancher, so I get crap from vegans all day long, in this ear, both ears, all the time. They're like, if we got rid of the cattle, we got rid of the feedlots, man, we wouldn't have to grow so much corn, we wouldn't have to grow all that soy, you wouldn't need that protein, blah, blah, blah. We'd be able to reclaim these acres and rewild all those corn acres and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you don't know how this system works. That corn and that soy is just going to find somewhere else to go. That's why you've got like Cargill and Tyson investing in plant-based foods, because that's somewhere else for the soy to go. That's somewhere else for the corn to go. That's why you have these guys, investing in vertical integration of like biofuels and bioplastics companies, because that's where they see, this stream of cheap commodities being able to go. You also have things like crop dumping. You'll have the United States producing way more corn than anybody would ever need. So they take that stuff over to Africa, they take it to India, they take it to the global South, they take it to Vietnam, they take it to China, and they dump it. And they crash local, local agricultural economies around the world, just so that we can keep producing and occupying that land, so we can keep it colonized. So there's a reason for, native people to not be on that landscape. So there's a reason for the Piscataway not to be there. So there's a reason for the Lakota, the Dakota, the Creek, the Cheraw, all those people to not be there. We got to justify all this colonialism somehow, right? So that tends to all be a part of that. You have this kind of perpetual motion device where the wealth that comes from the federal government feeds this system, and it becomes this perpetual motion device. And eventually, land and farming becomes inaccessible. It is really, really rare. Like, when is the last time you heard of somebody outside of farming breaking into conventional agriculture? Somebody from completely outside who decided, you know what? I grew up in Chicago. I really want to farm grain and corn and wheat. So I'm gonna go to ag school. I'm gonna get an agronomy degree, and I'm gonna buy 3,000 acres and a combine and a harvester and a spreader and a wait, what? Like that doesn't happen. It's all inherited, because the ability to get onto the landscape to do this is just, it's too hard. There's too much money. When you have USDA offices that are localized and that are federalized, and where you have to know the right people at the FSA office to get a loan, and you're coming from the outside and they don't know who your family is, you're going to get denied. If there's a history of racism in that FSA office or that USDA office, you're going to get denied. Like the thing is deliberately opaque and difficult to penetrate into. So you just have this system of incumbent wealth protecting itself. And as much as we talk about farm debt, and the $400 billion farm debt, we tend not to talk about the other side of the balance sheet, the $3.2 trillion of farm assets that more than cover those debts. And how you have people who, the median net worth is something like $800,000, and the median income of farmers, when you take away the fact that half of the farms are apparently making net losses, most of their incomes, however, when you count all farm stuff, is well above the national median. So it's a club. It is deliberately made difficult to break into, especially if you look like me, or if you look like Lindsay, or if you look like Rick, or like a lot of other people that are on this call. It's by design. Meanwhile, on the other side of it, on the farming side, you have concentrations of wealth in terms of land, in terms of equipment, and livestock and things like that. On the other side, agribusiness, you've got publicly traded companies that are making their wealth on this continuous stream of cheap commodities. Like, that is the underlying basis of their wealth. If you look at graphs of you talk about like the amount that consumers spend on food dollars, the agricultural dollar has been like this, on this bottom side for a long time. The agribusiness side has been like this. And all that middle is being captured as market share, as market cap, and as cash by agribusiness. So, these guys are kind of, agribusiness, agriculture is kind of two sides of the same coin that are getting very wealthy in very different ways, and have a system that has its flaws, where occasionally, a farmer will get screwed. Look at US dairy, or, occasionally agribusiness will get screwed. Look what happened to JBS when COVID hit, or at least look what happened to their workers. Excuse me. but it works for them. Fundamentally, it works for them. It does what it was always supposed to do, which is extract wealth from the landscape. Meanwhile, since these agribusinesses have the power they have, since they have the money that they have, they are able to lobby government the same way that these kind of concentrated rural economies that are dominated by increasingly large farmers, they're able to kind of perform a kind of regulatory capture of the government this in the same way. And that's how you wind up with all the exploitation you see endemic in agriculture. So exploitation of farm workers, again, JBS, and people having to work cheek to jowl during COVID, and having meat processing plants being, the epicenters of COVID outbreaks in its initial stages. The exploitation of natural resources, the constant degradation of soil, the creation of dead zones in the bay, all the chemical pollution that we see coming up the manure lagoons, and the fact that they're always placed somehow magically near minority communities, just by accident, I guess. Like, all this exploitation that we see in that industry. And then the result is cheap food that, and it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're Black, whether you're white, whether you're Indigenous, Latinx, man, woman, whatever, we're becoming more and more dependent on food being cheap because our wages are being eroded. We don't have the buying power that our parents had. We don't have, they don't have they had the buying power that their parents had, but, opportunity is going down for us. Wages are stagnant, and we require this food to be cheap. So it's kind of this perpetual motion device, where in the end, the only people who win are the people who have been winning the whole time. So, when I got into farming, back 7-8 years ago, I didn't know any of this. It was, the whole shtick that you get out of the farm to table movement is that, food is cheap and it's the consumer's fault. It's because the consumer isn't making the right decisions. The consumer isn't educating themselves. Like, it's the consumer refusing to vote with their food dollars and value the farmer's work. And, if the farmer got a bigger share of this money, then, everything would be okay. And like, the degree of sophistication around the conversation of why food is cheap and why we see the disparities in health and representation in farming, where like 98% of farmland is owned by white people and things like that. Like, this thing you see in this diagram never gets talked about, of how sophisticated and deep and longitudinal this problem is. So, when we had our soul searching moment, we kind of realized, okay, we have a really fundamental problem that goes well beyond, if we make our individual farms good enough, and if we optimize those farms and make them lean enough and make them organizationally and operationally effective enough, then we'll be able to compete. That is not true. There is too much money, there is too much incumbent power, there is too much political power, and too much inertia in the system as it exists today for us to believe that we can create a better future by operating as individuals, and not operating at a systemic level and trying to really engineer a solution to how do we compete with this system by creating an alternative system that is just as sophisticated, just as intelligent, but operates with the right ethics. So what does that mean? And I'm sorry, I'm trying to keep track of time because I'm probably gonna go way over, I'm sorry. So, to figure out how to solve this problem, it's like, all right, we again step back, especially going back to my own indigenous roots, about how did, when you look at indigenous people, not only in the past, but in the present, where you have indigenous people today who control something like, I think indigenous people around the world control 5 or 6% of the Earth's landmass, for protecting something like 80% of the planet's remaining biodiversity, which is just a jaw-dropping figure that nobody talks about. It was published in National Geographic. It's been very well studied, but almost never talked about by anyone. What are the ethics that these indigenous people around the world use to make sure that they have an environment that is not only sustainable for its own self, but is also able to feed people and make people happy and provide high quality of life, and do what we're all, I think, no matter what your politics are, no matter who you are, I think anybody would agree that the meaning of life is to enjoy one another's cooking, and the rest is just extra. But we got to get that first part right. So when you look at the way indigenous people, my own ancestors who used to, steward the Potomac River and the lands just to the north of it, the whole point was to protect land and water and air as a community. There was no concept of private property. There was no concept of drawing lines around a piece of land and saying, this is mine and my family's, and that is yours and your family's, because it didn't make any sense. You can't really protect one piece of land and not protect another piece of land, because the piece that you're not protecting is going to bleed over into this one, and it's not going to matter. So everything was protected as a commons, and the idea was to protect its ability to provide the resources that everyone needed, whether you were human, whether you were plant, whether you were animal, whatever you were. The point was that if everybody thrives, if everybody, everybody has to survive, everybody has to thrive, or nobody does in the long term. So we've kind of taken that model and gone away from the idea of the small family farm and saying, okay, what if we got a whole lot of people to protect a whole lot of land in common, and did things in more of an indigenous way, instead of like adopting this kind of colonizer feudalistic kind of section of like, this is yours, this is yours, this is yours. And we decided to integrate that with food production. So our system today is largely based on, we maintain huge tracts of forest and river systems and silvopasture, et cetera. And we do intensive food production on a fairly small amount of that landscape. So if we're protecting 1,000 acres, we might do like rotational grazing and market gardens and et cetera on maybe like, I don't know, maybe like 110. And the rest of it is then what traditionally we think of as like a conservation easement, where you're not farming it, but what we're actually doing is indigenous management. So we're harvesting, the nut mass, we're hunting in it, we're we're engaging in fishery, we're helping things like pawpaw and American persimmon thrive in the understory. So we have like, lots and lots of different harvests coming at lots and lots of different times of the year. So we have this kind of integrated kind of mesh of intensive and extensive ways of producing food on the landscape. And kind of like I said at the beginning, the protection of this landscape, who owns land isn't really a concept that we deal with here. It's more of, we have a nonprofit called Something Else Society, which maintains our leases and our land ownership as a single entity that is partially owned or controlled, since it is a nonprofit. It's not owned by anybody, but controlled by a board of trustees that consists of people from every business in our ecosystem. So all the farms, all the ranches, all the processors, all the distributors, even the restaurants are going to have a say in this kind of community food system trust, which is what this NGO is, that maintains all of our land tenure arraignments, all the ownership, all the lease, all of that stuff. So the land is held in one big community that is kind of collectively owned by everyone. So we don't look at the, this part is yours, this part is yours, this part is yours. It's this whole landscape is all of ours to protect and feed this community with. On the flip side of that, you have capital, because those are kind of the two big things that really trip up new farmers. When I was coming in, I said we came in with like a dozen other people, and 3 years later, only 2 of us were left. The thing that tripped everybody up was land tenure, access to capital, access to financing, access to credit, and eventually access to shared services. So people would go down not because, they weren't great farmers and not because they couldn't access land. They'd go down because they didn't have the right kind of insurance at the right time, or they didn't have enough of it, or they weren't able to brand themselves well, or they were not able to develop a market because they were just in the wrong place and couldn't find buyers and didn't have the time to try to cultivate buyers because they were on the ground doing the work, like trying to do the farming. So, we figured, what if we had a system where we had this set of foundational services, land, capital, markets, accounting, legal, insurance, audit, regulatory compliance, all that stuff ready for Black and brown farmers who want to come onto the landscape that's just, that's kind of done for you. And you can concentrate on doing what you're good at. You can concentrate on being, a kick-ass produce farmer, a really good rancher. You can focus on your food truck and making sure that everything is done farm to table. You can focus on being a community chef and making sure that people in vulnerable communities are fed for free, affordably, while we try to figure out a long-term solution that's not based on charity. Our whole thing was create this environment where these farms, where these sustainable, community-oriented, solidarity-based enterprises could thrive, by default, and not have success be limited to these outliers who mostly started out with, with so many resources that they ultimately would have been good at anything. We need average people who were good at the things that we need done on the landscape to be able to succeed no matter what. So our point was to create this foundation of systems so that you could have teams of people, independent businesses, who are united in this in this goal towards creating regional food sovereignty in Baltimore, in DC, in the Tidewater, in Richmond, so that they could come together and do what they're good at, be a really good chef, be a really good farmer, be a really good seed keeper, be a really good farm marketer, and not have to be everything else. Because right now it's like, farmers are kind of like cops. Like, we expect cops to do everything, right? We expect cops to enforce the law and be social workers and pull your cat out of the tree and, chase the guy down the street that stole your watch. And, we expect all these things. And on the other side, we expect farmers to be, we expect them to be agronomists and distributors and sit at the farmer's market for 4 hours and then take down from the farmer's market for 2 hours and pay 6% on top of that. And, you got to be the one to hire people. You got to keep the books. It's you and your wife, and you're both going crazy because you're trying to do the jobs of like 7, 8, 9 different people all by yourselves. So, what if all of that stuff was taken care of? And you could come in, with like 4 or 5 good friends or whatever who want to do this land-based enterprise and just do that and make a living, because not only can you farm, or not only can you run your, your food truck or your restaurant or whatever, but you can work anywhere in the food system you want. There's this concept that we have of like borderless employment, where everybody is able to work, in whatever, parts of the business they want, because there's full transparency. If you're a farmer in this system, you have first dibs on gigs in the processor or in the marketing outfits, and vice versa. So that kind of everybody knows what everybody's doing. Everybody understands different parts of the food system, even though they have expertise in the one thing that they're, really, really good at. And these enterprises, they're worker owned. You have a voice in terms of how you're paid, how you operate, the ethics you operate under. You're not just an employee who's just this fungible gear in an economic machine that can just be replaced whenever you decide to act up or not come to work. Because, yeah, dude, there is a plague out there and people are getting sick and dying, especially if they're Black and brown. Maybe you don't want to come to work today because you don't want to die and you don't want to kill grandma. When you have a voice in your company and you're not just an employee, you're not just some peon, you're able to get that measure of justice out of your system. And in the meantime, if enough of these businesses are able to come in and thrive, suddenly, instead of having like, one farm that's on 10 acres, one farm that's on 100 acres, suddenly you maybe have, 500 farms that are commanding something like 50,000 acres, which isn't a lot in the grand scheme of things. We're talking about, US farmland, something like 900 million acres. It's a lot, but you got to start somewhere. And if you have a plan that allows itself to scale and grow and is able to do it under its own weight and doesn't rely on somebody like me being a guru to come in and like show everybody the right way, but it's a truly self-sustaining, functioning economy that's able to expand itself with a kind of ethical conscience as to why it's expanding and who it's serving. Not just shareholders, not just investors, not just people that put their money in, but the people who need to eat, the people who need to work, the people in that community, where you localize your food chains as much as possible so you're not as vulnerable to supply chain disruptions when it comes to things like COVID and climate change and all these things we're going to keep getting hit by, then you've got something worth talking about. And if it goes far enough, you might be surprised by what could happen. If you create these successful food economies in rural areas, because they are going to be land-based, suddenly you have rural repopulations being assisted by things like reparations, cash-based reparations, land-based reparations, land back, all these terms you might have heard of. When that happens, you have a restoration of representative democracy. When I started here, like in the middle of nowhere, there was 2 of us. There was me and my wife. Now there's 12 of us. 2 years from now, there's probably going to be 150 of us. We're going to be able to swing local elections. If we can swing local elections, we can start swinging national elections. This kind of stuff can happen from the bottom up, and it's all based on creating diverse food economies out here, because that's what we have in abundance out here in rural America is land and soil and good resources. So let's use those, but in a different way, where we're not just having a few people mine those resources and concentrate political power, but let's create an economy where we bring people in and spread that spread that prosperity out and restore democracy, at least at the local level, so that we can start getting somewhere with these systems. When you have more of a kind of a representative democracy, then you have you have the ability to control the public purse in a way where it actually reflects the popular will, and not just the interests of a few people who are kind of like feudal lords out here in rural America. But you have things like community investment, you have you have conservation grants that make sense, you have land access that becomes a matter of national policy, and not just like a few guilty white people maybe saying, here's 100 acres that you can lease for 100 years or something like that. But you have like actual land back that's legislated. You might have like efforts at reparations that we can actually use to create economies that serve everybody. And when you have that, you have this fair distribution. When that distribution goes into an economy where the people who are working in that economy, the people who own that economy and who eat from that economy, when that money, when those resources are going back to everyone and they all have ownership, they all have votes, then you have a public purse that actually serves the public and isn't just government pork that goes to a few, like a select few rich people who are in the right place at the right time. So that's kind of the system that we have proposed as an alternative to what we have now. The system that we have now definitely has abundant and cheap food. Not a lot of people are starving to death in the United States, even though kind of paradoxically food insecurity is going up in this country. But it's based on this kind of foundation of inequality and environmental degradation and weak democracy. And we're seeing the consequences of it now, where you've got a place like Texas where people are freezing to death. In the richest, most powerful country in the world, people are freezing to death. It's stupid that that's happening. And we have an alternative where we have affordable food, accessible food that may not be cheap, because we're not basing that cheapness on taking things out of the ground, but where we have a foundation of broad-based prosperity, environmental restoration, and strong democracy that works for people. So that's my pitch, and that's what we're working on here in just in the shadow of Washington, D.C. We've got 5 businesses right now that are part of this collective, and within our 5-year plan, we plan to have at least 50 of these enterprises, spooled up. We plan to be controlling thousands and thousands of acres by then, with a war chest of at least in the 8 figures, probably in the 9 figures, and really be working to change this system from the ground up by not just focusing on the farms, but focusing on food economies that let good farming, good food service, and a good input sector really, really thrive. So thank you, everybody, for listening to me rant about the state of everything. And I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has. I have nothing else to do today. I cleared my whole schedule. So as long as you'll have me, I will answer questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Newman. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was riveting, and thank you for the visuals as well. I'll hand it back over to Mr. Miles Robinson now, and he'll help field questions. But we've already got, you can check the chat box, already got glowing reviews in the chat box. So thank you so much. And Mr. Robinson, if you can lead us through Q&A, we'd appreciate it so much. But again, thank you, Mr. Newman.
Oh, yeah. Lindsay, you can stay right there. Excellent job, excellent presentation, a lot of power-packed information, a lot of foresight. We really thank you for all that you presented this morning. It really provokes a lot of thought. And let's just go ahead and open up for some questions. I know that some people have already brought some. Okay, yeah, I've seen a lot of people clap their hands and agreeing with you out there. So that seems like the biggest thing on the chat box here.
That's good news.
Any questions? Any burning questions while we have time here? Go right ahead. Questions? Feel free, anyone. Most of what I see in the chat box are just congratulatory and thanking you for what you've presented.
Mr. Robinson,
Yes.
questions, do you want them to put them in the chat box, or would you want people to just go ahead and unmute themselves? What would be best?
Yeah, let's go ahead and just unmute yourself. If you have a question, let's just go ahead and do that.
Okay.
I know we're running a little over, but I think we have. Go ahead. Right ahead.
The group that oversees the properties and the businesses, how does the spirit of that group stay together, not factionalized? This whole hierarchy of who's in charge, and then the fallouts between groups, families. So that's human nature. What is the secret sauce to keep this group together and can sustain that through generations, the togetherness?
Yeah, so the group that manages our land trust, for example, its board consists of people who are designated as what I kind of call wahata, which is as loosely translates to speaker, but somebody who's designated to be responsible on behalf of the different organizations that work in our system. They are on the boards. They're on the board of that NGO that manages the landscape. So when we create a plan for, if we get, like a 1,000-acre MOU from like a historic plantation that wants to engage in reparations or whatever, we all together decide how we're going to connections unstable. We all decide together like what the management plan is going to be for that landscape. When everybody's putting together their operational plans for the year, like, talking about money and talking about capital, we kind of work all together, hand in glove, on each person's business, on each business's business plan, on their capital requirements, on their budgets, on their operational plans, to make sure that they have the money that they need and the resources they need to be successful on the ground. So I don't know, it's kind of hard to say what the secret sauce is, but besides the fact that people are able to participate genuinely, that there really is no one who's in charge. There isn't really an executive board. It's run in a very kind of flat indigenous kind of way, where it's a collection of people representative of all these different entities in this federation who are respected enough and have the social capital in their organizations to be able to speak for them. And then once we're all together, the fact that the reason that we're here in the first place is because we are all pursuing food sovereignty, because we're all pursuing ecological sustainability, and we're not necessarily looking out for like the family estate or any kind of like necessarily private interest beyond happy and financially whole ourselves. It makes it easier. And I think another thing that does make it easier and a little bit unconventional is that all of our farmers at this point are coming from outside of agriculture. So they don't have those like family legacies and family estates to kind of worry about necessarily at the expense of everyone else. This is something we built literally from the ground up. And a question I get a lot is, how come we didn't go out and create a co-op of farmers to do this? And that's a lot of the reason why we didn't. Is because when you try to bring in people who already have this kind of established interest in the old model, it gets hard. Maybe it gets too hard. And I think maybe down the road, we'll find a way to incorporate people who have been, on the land doing farming and doing food for multiple generations. But for now, I think a lot of what kind of the secret sauce is the fact that we have people coming in from the outside and have new ideas and completely new paradigms about how to relate to the landscape, how to relate to one another as a collective.
Great. Thank you for that. Follow-up? You have a follow-up? Any other questions?
Yeah, I got a question, Miles. The the speaker mentioned, participatory democracy. How does your organization participate in, let's say, local governance, and how does that governance react to you?
How have they reacted to us? We have been, what's the best way to say this? The local kind of good old boy network, they know we're here, and they're not happy about it. We've definitely already run into local political pressure to block efforts that we've made to buy infrastructure, to get a hold of land, to get permitting, things like that. When they've been able to find out who we are, because I'll tell you something we do when we deal with local government, when we deal with these kind of projects where we're trying to like kind of change the composition of how the community works, we tend to send in white people. So like when we have to go to the local FSA office, I'll send my wife, or I'll send John, or I'll send, Jack, or one of the people that looks like, one of the old people from around here. And then by the time a deal is done, it's kind of too late. And, the door's been held open and in come the black people. And that sounds kind of coarse, but that's the way it is around here. You kind of have to like, sneak your way into these economies. But in terms of how we participate in local politics, we're really not there yet. We kind of have to build up a little bit more of a critical mass. Right now, we kind of have this term like a gross domestic product for all the businesses that operate within us. We're still very small. Combined, it's something like $2.5 million a year in revenue between all the businesses. So it's not huge yet, because we've only been pursuing this model. Because when I talk about it, it can sound like we've been doing this for years. We've only been doing this kind of distributed, federated collective model since like July of 2020. So it hasn't been that long. So before we start like really trying to like flex any muscle in terms of like, how the political composition of the town works and things like that, I think we need to be at a point where we're providing more jobs, where we're a bigger part of the economy, and where frankly we have bigger carrots and bigger sticks to be able to influence how things work around here. But yeah, I'll definitely say that, when you're coming out here, to rural America, you are not welcome, especially if you're enterprising, especially, and this is something that really kind of, blew me away a little bit. It's like, I was coming in trying to create jobs, create opportunity, not just for Black people, not just Indigenous people, but everybody, because the whole local economy around here is extremely depressed. The powers that be, the town fathers, are not cool with that. Especially somebody from the outside coming in and saying, hey, I'm going to create opportunity, because, the people who are incumbent in power, their whole power base is based on we're the ones who create opportunity and no one else. So that's the thing to watch out for.
Chris, we thank you. We're about 40 minutes over our time, but it's great. No problem. Great presentation, great interaction. And there's one other, just a general question in the chat box that asks your opinion of how much money does a farm have to join a co-op or a collection of farmers?
Yeah, so for ours, we don't require that anybody have any money.
Sure.
So let's say there's like this is happening right now. There's a group of 3 guys that want to come in and they want to join our collective. They don't need any money. Okay. You just need an idea of what you want to do.
Okay.
And me, being kind of half in the Sylvanaqua Farms part and half of something else society, as part of something else society, I work with them to figure out, okay, what do you want to do? What do you want to grow? Where do you want to grow it? And let's develop a business plan or financial plan for you that says how you're going to do it. You can go through, Chop to Go Farm, which is one of our collectives that operates as a teaching farm, so that you have all the fundamentals of how to grow produce, the right way. So you're not hitting this huge learning curve that I ran into when I got into ranching. So you come in, you get business planning done, you get trained. And once you're trained and once your business planning is done, we cut you a check. You don't have to go to the USDA. You don't have to go to the FSA. You pay the federally minimum, there's a minimum amount of interest you have to pay on a loan in order for it to be considered a loan and not a gift. So you pay that, barely 1% interest rate, to get yourself started. And, you take your first 2 years not having to pay any of it back, and then pay it back in chunks over a period of 5 years, and then you're in. It's the thing where the collective gives you money. Like, that's the point of making it easy. We give you money and then you pay it back when you're good, and we make sure that you're good.
Okay. Dean, I think, I thought I heard you were getting to make another thought. You had another thought. I didn't mean to cut you off. Dr. Hill?
I have a question too, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Hi, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Faray Muhammad. I recently graduated from Florida A&M as an agricultural engineer. And so I relate to you in a lot of ways as far as not coming from an ag, like I've never been involved in farming as a child, but I've always been interested in food security and water security. And so currently I work with the NRCS, which is a branch of the USDA. And so I wanted to know if there's a better way that we can help people, because our whole motto is helping people help the land. So how can we better help, this type of initiative?
I get asked this question a lot and I never have a good answer. And I think the reason is, a thing that I say that a lot of people would disagree with is that if the access to federal funding around land and agriculture, if you took out the racism part, where people with the right last name and the people with the right skin color are able to get money and people who don't have that aren't, if you took that away and you level that playing field, I think the USDA does enough. There's lots of money and resources available for farmers. I mean, huge amounts of resources. When I got involved with when Sarah Mock, who was an agriculture journalist and has written a lot of books about how agriculture and agribusiness works, kind of behind the scenes, that was a real eye-opening experience about exactly how many resources are out there, from housing to cash to operational assistance to technical assistance, extension services, et cetera. Like, the resources are there. And as long as it were fair to get to them, and there was kind of a kind of centralized clearinghouse to be able to get to some of those services, like I said, my experience is that you get different experiences depending where you are in the country and who your local, for example, FSA officer is. If that was more standardized and if it was more fair and that playing field was level, I think the Fed does plenty. And I think, when I've had a lot of criticism of things like the Justice for Black Farmers Act, but I think the one big thing that it does get right is that it tries to put representation for who gets funding and make that more equitable and fair. And I think the big thing that federal entities need to do is make sure that their provisioning of their resources actually reflects the demand and doesn't just reflect access.